We got a legal update on James Pearce today, but nothing has really changed with the 6-game suspension from the NFL still looming.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast. I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron. And on today's Locked On Falcons, we will not be talking about the second round of OTAs that began on Tuesday for the Atlanta Falcons, right? We're just waiting for those 6 to 8 second practice clips to overanalyze. But since we haven't gotten those yet today, maybe tomorrow, instead, we're going to revisit the 2023 draft class and talk about several of those players coming up for contracts. We will not be talking about Bijan Robinson. We will be talking mainly about Matthew Bergeron and Zach Harrison. Bijan had his 5th-year option picked up, as now he is signed through the 2028 season. We'll see if the Falcons wind up extending Bijan later this summer. Multiple NFL insiders have reported that as likely. We'll see, what the timeline is, because those same insiders are saying that the priority is going to be Drake London, whose contract is up after the season, and we're expecting to see some movement for Drake, hopefully before training camp gets started, and then hopefully the Falcons will pivot to Bijan before week 1. But speaking of week 1, a player the Falcons are probably going to be without is James Pearce Jr., and we'll start today's episode talking about the updated legal situation, as we got a little bit clarity on that side of things. Back on the day of the draft, the first night of the draft, we got some resolution on James Pearce's situation stemming from the charges stemming from that February incident where he was allegedly stalking his ex-girlfriend, Rickea Jackson, which involved him allegedly ramming his car into hers. And basically, we learned last month in April that wouldn't go to trial as long as he attended an intervention program. And upon completion of that intervention program, it would lead to all the charges against him being dropped. And those initial reports were that intervention program would last 6 months. And on today, the update that we got is that will be a 12-month program. And for those of you that missed that episode, just basically summarizing what that program will involve, it's been reportedly that he'll have to attend regular therapy sessions, anger management courses and whatnot. He'll have to undergo drug tests beyond the normal NFL and NFLPA drug tests and stay clean from that, as well as adhere to a restraining order from Rickea Jackson for the extent of that program. So for the next 12 months, there was an opportunity for Rickea Jackson to basically put forth a permanent restraining order against James Pearce today, but she elected to just go with the 12-month restraining order as opposed to that one. But this has generated, the situation has generated, I think, a lot of confusion with Falcon fans and some people in Falcons media. Because I think a lot of people have been assuming all along that the NFL won't suspend James Pearce as long as he's going through that program, and they will wait until after he completes the program in order to suspend him, and that is not going to be the case. Now, I can't say that with 100% certainty, but I'll say it with like 97% certainty that won't be the case, that he's still likely to get a 6-game suspension due to violating the NFL's personal conduct policy due to domestic violence. Again, cannot say that it will be a 6 games with 100% certainty, but as I've said before, if you do any amount of research on how the NFL has handled these incidents since upping their personal and revamping their personal conduct policy when it comes to domestic violence, stemming from that 2014 incident with Ray Rice, well over 90% of the time, again, not 100%, but well over 90% of the time, it results in a 6-game suspension, sort of a blanket 6-game suspension. And he doesn't necessarily have to finish the program in order for that 6-game suspension to come. And so, the way that you have to think about this is this intervention program is like probation. Technically, it's not probation, but think of it like probation. And just because a player is on probation does not mean that the NFL will wait to suspend him until he completes the probation. You see that with Rashee Rice, right, who got arrested back in March of 2024 for street racing. His legal situation didn't get resolved until July of 2025, which involved him serving 30 days in jail and then going on probation for 5 years. And the NFL then suspended him a month later in August of 2025. And that was for the start of the last season, the 2025 season, those first 6 games of the 2025 season. And then recently, this past week, Rashee Rice did violate his probation by testing positive for marijuana. And, that could put him back in jail for 30 days. And maybe the NFL adds further discipline on top of that suspension, an additional suspension, one up to potentially 4 games for the drug policy. We'll see on that front. Locked On Chiefs will have you covered if you want to stay tuned to that. But the larger point is the NFL did not wait for Rashee Rice to undergo 5 years of probation before handing him that suspension. And we saw the same exact situation involving domestic violence issues with other players that were formerly suspended. Former Seahawks wide receiver D. Eskridge, right, got arrested in February 2023 for domestic violence dispute. He was never convicted. He got a 12-month deferred sentence in May of 2023 and basically had to go to therapy for a year and would have the charges dropped, which is basically the same situation that James Pearce is. But then in August of 2023, the NFL still suspended him for the first 6 games of that season. Similarly, Charles Omenihu got arrested in January 2023 for allegedly pushing his girlfriend. He was arrested. No formal charges were given on him. The police couldn't find enough evidence to present formal charges, but the NFL still suspended him 6 games at the start of that 2023 season. So again, there is a strong precedent that regardless of what happens with James Pearce and this intervention program, whether he completes it, doesn't complete it, doesn't matter. The NFL will definitely, again, I won't say definitely, but again, the strong precedent that they will suspend him for the first 6 games of this upcoming season. And I don't expect the NFL to make that decision formally until August. That has been the norm over the years, that they basically wait till, within the first month before the season starts, before they hand out their suspensions. There are examples where they don't do that, but they're usually much, much more high profile situations and don't necessarily involve these types of incidents. Basically, what we'll learn with James Pearce, he'll be clear to participate in training camp as well as the preseason, even after that suspension is handed down sometime in August. But it will just basically, when he officially goes on the reserve suspension list, which will probably be final cuts, which I believe this year or September 1st, that's when he'll be forced to step away from the team and then return to the team following week 6 ahead of their week 7 matchup against the 49ers, if I'm not mistaken. Wanted to correct a lot of misinformation out there about this situation. I think a lot of people are confused about how this situation works. And we'll see what's what with James Pearce on that sort of situation. But we'll leave that situation aside and look beyond this upcoming season by looking back at the 2023 Falcons draft class, where we have a couple of guys that are potentially due for some massive paydays. And we'll start that conversation talking about Matthew Bergeron. And basically, if things break his way this upcoming season, he could become one of the highest paid guards in football come 2027. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the NHL playoffs are here with the Stanley Cup Finals coming up, and it's time for you to make your power play in the bedroom. Maybe you want to rock your significant other like a Carolina Hurricane, or you want to hit them with a Colorado Avalanche, or you just want to get Minnesota Buck Wild in the bedroom, and that's where our sponsor Rugiet comes in. Rugiet offers treatments designed to help you get ready and stay ready when it matters. We know performance matters on the ice, but it matters off the ice, and Rugiet's top option, Rugiet Ready, is a mint that dissolves under your tongue with clinically proven ingredients, and it works fast and often in about 15 minutes. That's just a couple of sessions in the penalty box, and then you can break out of that penalty box and you can last up to 36 hours without being penalized, ladies and gentlemen. So they also offer Go Long, designed to help you with both performance and control. So head to rugiet.com/lockedonnhl and you'll get 15% off your ED treatment. That's RUGIET.com/lockedonnhl for 15% off. Rugiet, performance medicine for men. Now, if you want to experience an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons without interruptions, so you don't have to hear these awkward Rugiet reads, the Everydayer Club is built for you. And right now, you can get a 7-day free trial. Check it out. Get many of the perks, including that ad-free experience, at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So let's revisit the Falcons 2023 draft class. Sans Bijan Robinson. That consists of Matthew Bergeron, Zach Harrison, Clark Phillips, DeMarco Hellum still on the roster. Javon Gwynn is already headed out the door to following Dwayne Ledford to Baltimore. We'll talk about Phillips and Hellums briefly. Both of those guys are on the roster bubble heading into training camp. Notably, I did not have Clark Phillips on my 53-man roster projection earlier this month, nor did I put him on my 16-man practice squad projection. Hellums, I did have Falcons making the roster, but as I mentioned in an episode, he's far from a lock at this point in time. Phillips is going to need a strong summer just to make the team, and then even a stronger season if there's any plans on the Falcons giving him a second deal next spring. And then Hellums, certainly his upside is really about special teams, and so he's going to need to be, by year's end, identified as a core special teams player by this new coaching staff, ingratiate himself with Craig Ackerman, the new special teams coach, because there's a low probability that he's going to, even if there are injuries, that he's going to do anything on defense that's going to ingratiate himself with Jeff Ulbrich, but you never know. And so that leaves basically the guys in the 23 draft class beyond Bijan Robinson likely paying for second deals here in Atlanta are Zach Harrison and Matthew Bergeron. Bergeron, he's been a player that I've been critical of over the last 3 seasons on the podcast, but I've made peace with his development so far. He's gotten better year after year, even if he hasn't grown into the force as the run blocker that I originally hoped for when the Falcons drafted him and traded up for him in round 2 back in 2023. He has made progress in that regard and certainly has made the biggest progress in terms of being a very capable pass protector. And if he continues to grow and make another leap, I think that will put him front and center for a second deal. The issue with Bergeron, I think, is just going to boil down to money, right? It's a similar situation we saw last year with Drew Dahlman, right? That on the open market, a player like Bergeron could merit a huge deal, right? Potentially more money than the Falcons are willing to pay. That we're talking about potentially, somewhere in the range of $20 million per year. You look at Zion Johnson, a first-round pick from the 2022 draft that hit the open market this past offseason. He just signed a multi-year deal worth $16.5 million to the Cleveland Browns this past year. We saw Aaron Banks last offseason sign for $19 million plus on an open market. And if you just look at that $16.5 million deal from Zion Johnson, that's about 5.5% of this year's $301.2 million salary cap. And if you project that the salary cap to increase to $330 million range, as many people are next year, 5.5% of that would be roughly around $18 million per year. Now, obviously, we have a whole season of football that needs to be played that could help raise or lower that potential market money, but I think that's a fair market value for Matthew Bergeron, around $18 million in terms of projecting what a potential contract could be for him next year. And it's a similar conversation, as I said, surrounding Bergeron potentially that surrounded Drew Dahlman a year ago, and questioning whether or not he's worth that type of price tag. And now $18 million as we sit here today would make Bergeron currently one of the 10, I think like it would be 8th or 9th, 10 highest paid guards in football. And I'm sure a lot of people, myself included, may not look at Bergeron and say, oh, that's a top 10 guard, across football. But it's kind of a similar conversation we have about Jake Matthews, right? Jake Matthews gets paid like a top 5, top 10 left tackle in the league. But I think most of us would probably say Jake is probably in that 12 to 15 range when you're ranking left tackles. But the thing that makes Jake Matthews worth it is the consistency, the durability, right? He plays a premium position at that left tackle position, and sort of the alternative to Jake Matthews is a lot less appealing for a team like the Falcons, because if you're going to find a comparable, if not better left tackle than Jake Matthews, you're almost certainly going to have to use a top 10, top 15 draft pick to find that caliber of player. And you're not necessarily having that same conversation when it comes to potentially upgrading a player like Matthew Bergeron at the guard position, because theoretically you could find a comparable, if not better player on day 2 of the draft, typically at the top of round 2. On day 2 of the draft, but it's a little bit more feasible. It's not, hey, you got to use a top 10, top 15 pick to get a better left tackle. You could find that guy in the 40s or 50s in any given draft for that left guard position. And so, we've seen it consistently over the last few off seasons that unless you're a true difference maker on the interior of the offensive line, most teams will let you test the market. It'll be interesting to see if the Falcons, which direction they go on that front. I think as we sit here today, we don't look at Bergeron as a true difference maker on the interior of the offensive line. But as we discussed last week on the podcast on Friday's episode with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Georgia Tech, the Falcons offensive line could be due for a potential revamp. But I think most of us are kind of locked in on that offensive tackle position as the position where you're worried about it, right? You have 3 starters as we sit here today, due to be free agents after this season. That's Bergeron, that's center Ryan Nuzul, and right tackle Jalon Taylor. You probably are prioritizing offensive tackle in the draft, again, due to that premium. Center is a position that typically is not a premium position in the draft, and typically you can find a capable starting center in the 3rd, 4th round, so typically in the middle round. So if you are looking for a draft pick, you don't necessarily have to prioritize that early in the draft. And then that's assuming that we're not sitting here, 6 months from now talking about James Brockermeyer, the undrafted free agent pickup that the Falcons had that a lot of people think could be developed into, the replacement for Ryan Nuzul down the road. And so given those circumstances with 3 looming free agents, you have an opportunity potentially next year to draft a new right tackle, to draft a new center. Do you want to open that door and create another problem by needing to have to draft or sign a free agent, right? And, again, any competent starting free agent guard on the open market is going to be expensive. So even if you're sitting there, just ask the Baltimore Ravens, right? They sat there and said, hey, we're not going to pay $27 million to Tyler Linderbaum. And they were basically like, we can get a cheaper option in the draft or free agency. They didn't find that guy available in their price range in free agency, nor did they solve that problem in the draft. And so there's a potential opportunity to learn that lesson if you're the Atlanta Falcons. And so it does make sense. Hey, we can potentially solve these other starting spots at center and right tackle in the draft, but do we want to have to force ourselves to do that with the left guard position by letting Bergeron walk? And so that leads me to think that as we sit here today, we are headed into a direction where Matthew Bergeron does get that second contract that is going to be potentially very pricey for the Atlanta Falcons. Again, can't say it with a high degree of certainty, but I would sit here and say, as we sit here on May 26th, as I'm recording this, there's like a 60 to 75% chance that the Falcons do decide ultimately that the lesser of 2 evils is paying Matthew Bergeron that market value, right? And particularly when you contrast that with the Drew Dalman situation, unlike the situation last offseason with Dalman, when the Falcons were kind of up against it from a cap standpoint, the Falcons should not have that problem, this time next year or 10 months from now, where currently overthecap.com is projecting them with the 3rd highest cap space heading into 2027 right now with roughly $125 million. That number will probably go down at some point in the next 10 months before we get to free agency. But even if the Falcons manage to spend 20% of that, which, I'm not expecting them to spend a lot more than that, you're still looking at $100 million and still, potentially top 5 in terms of overall cap space heading into next offseason. So they should be able to more than afford to pay Bergeron, even if it's going to be a little pricier than you ideally want. Wanting that stability on your offensive line makes a ton of sense, especially on the left side where you're potentially going to have to, bring in a new right tackle on the right side. So you want to maintain that stability on the left side. So we'll see if the Falcons go down that road. So, despite my frequent criticism of Matthew Bergeron, I sit here and I go, I feel like that's a smart, sound decision, especially if Bergeron can make another leap this upcoming season. So we'll see if he winds up doing that. And so, we'll also talk about whether another player from that 2023 draft class and 3rd round draft pick, Zach Harrison, can make another leap and become potentially the 4th horseman of the apocalypse for the Falcons pass rush. And we'll talk about his long-term outlook in that regard as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So support for today's episode comes from Square, which brings you a system that's going to help fix your biggest headaches when it comes to running a business. Starting a business is exciting, but running it can be a challenge because it gets complicated quickly with payments, inventory, and scheduling. It's a lot to manage, and Square is going to help you manage it by bringing everything together in one connected system. Square is going to help you keep track of payments, track sales, manage inventory, and keep your business running smoothly without juggling a bunch of disconnected tools. And I know for me, there's a local coffee shop that I love to frequent that has Square, and every time I go in there, it's like, ooh, checkout's going to be so convenient. And from the business side of things, it makes everything simple for them, makes them feel more efficient and professional. So if you're starting a business or running one that deserves better tools, Square can help you sell, manage, and grow without slowing you down. And right now, you can get up to $200 off Square hardware at square.com/go/LockedOnNFL. That's SQUARE.com/GO/LockedOnNFL. Run your business smarter with Square. Get started today. So wrapping up here is today's Locked On Falcons. It's a lot harder to project Zach Harrison's potential market than it was with Matthew Bergeron, just because the pass rush market is all over the place, right? Guard, as I said, if you're a starting caliber player, you're going to get a certain price tag. That's usually going to be $14, $15 million at the very least, potentially $20 million or more. There's a pretty specific range for those guys in terms of the open market. But, when it comes to pass rushers, it's like, yeah, you could sign a multi-year lucrative deal, or you might be forced to settle a one-year prove-it deal. If we look back to the 22 draft class that just hit the open market this past offseason, look at Arnold Bichetti, Boye Mafe, both taken in round 2 of that draft. Very similar career production in terms of total sacks and pressures. Mafe has a slight edge in that regard just because he's played more snaps than AK has over the last 4 years. But AK signed a one-year prove-it deal with the Eagles for $4.3 million this offseason. Meanwhile, Mafe signed a 3-year deal worth $60 million overall with the Cincinnati Bengals, right? And you go back the previous offseason, to the 2021 draft class, a similar player to Zach Harrison, Dayo Odeyingbo from the Colts, who Nate Ollie was very familiar with, signed a multi-year deal with the Bears for $16 million a year. And so I think if you're Zach Harrison, you're looking potentially to make a Dayo size contract on the open market. That's the type of deal. And again, if you're adjusting for salary cap inflation, $16 million in 2025 cap dollars would be about $18.5 to $19 million in 2027 cap dollars. And that to me, kind of the ceiling for what I think Zach Harrison could get on the open market. Odeyingbo had about 21.5 sacks, 128 pressures, 26 tackles for losses during the course of his rookie contract before he hit the open market. 3 years into Zach Harrison, he has about 8.5 sacks, 47 pressures, and about 15 tackles for loss. And so basically he needs to match his 3-year totals to reach the same level of production that Odeyingbo had going into free agency to potentially earn that sort of contract. That is doable. It's not as crazy as it seems like, because Harrison did have 4.5 sacks in 7 games last year, 16 pressures. If you extrapolate that to a full, healthy 17-game season, that's nearly 11 sacks and 38 pressures, right? And, the sack total may be a little bit inflated. As we've talked about many times, sacks are volatile. Harrison's 4.2 sack rate last year in terms of the sacks per snap he had rushing the quarterback last year was top 5 prior to his injury. I don't know if he would probably maintain that high sack rate because, again, the volatility of sacks after week 10. I'm skeptical of that because that sack rate was about 3 times higher what his career sack rate was when you combine his first 2 years of production here in Atlanta. But even if it did regress to the mean for the remaining 8 games, had he stayed healthy, that still would have been about 1.5 sacks added to his total for the season, giving him about 6 sacks last year. And so I think it's reasonable to go into this season thinking Zach Harrison should be able to get 6 to 8 sacks, potentially, if he's fully recovered this upcoming season. As we've stated many times over the past calendar year, this scheme really does enhance pass rush numbers, creating those one-on-ones for guys, and you just need a guy that can go out there and win them. And Harrison did that very effectively last year, especially when he lined up inside. His pressure rate last year, according to PFF, when he was on the interior, was 23% versus the 11% when he lined up outside. And I'm old enough to remember when people were complaining about Zach Harrison being bulking up and being asked to play on the interior last year, back going into the 2024 season, and people being like, "Oh, that's a horrible decision." And meanwhile, I'm just sitting here going like, "Well, you guys haven't watched Zach Harrison. I got to be smug here at some point here on the podcast, guys, and toot my own horn." But I sat here and said like he projects much better as an interior pass rusher than an quote unquote exterior pass rusher, given his skill set. And that 23% pressure rate on the interior, when you look at guys, the rest of the info, that was at the top, right? As far as interior rushers go, if you just look at guys that had at least 25 pass rushing snaps on the interior, and we have to lower that threshold to that number just because Zach Harrison only had about 35 snaps across the 7 games he played. The only player that had a higher pressure rate than Zach Harrison on the interior was Ed Oliver at 26%. Jihad Ward was right behind Zach Harrison at 20%. Walter Nolan was at 20% as well. In terms of the full-time, true guys that we talk about as full-time defensive tackles, Jeffrey Simmons was the top guy at 14%. Quentin Williams was 13%. Kobe Turner, Braden Fisk were also 13%. And Christian Barmore rounds out the top 5 at about 12%. So we're talking about Zach Harrison really achieving at a high level. He's even better than Jeffrey Simmons. You can tell that to your friends. And as if you want to gas up Zach Harrison. And again, it speaks to what Zach Harrison has the potential to be, even if that number comes down. Again, you cut that number in half. He's still one of the best interior pass rushers in the NFL with more opportunities this upcoming season. And so we've discussed before about the Falcons trying to figure out what their 4-man pass rushers are going to look like, especially when they go to their nickel sub package and play that 4-2 over front. We know Jalon Walker and Brandon Dorlus are going to be 2 of those guys. We assume once James Pearce gets back from his 6-game suspension, he'll be the 3rd guy. And the big question is just who's going to be the 4th guy that you can consistently rely on to be that alternative option and form the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for this pass rush. And I think Harrison, if he can pick up where he left off and be healthy this year, is as good a bet as you can possibly make. And that could really do wonders for his potential to earn a second contract. Time will tell on that. But I think even if he doesn't put it all together, there's a possibility that he could sign one of these 1-year cheap prove it deals, for like, I don't know, $5 or $6 million next year. That's certainly, I think, the potential floor for Zach Harrison if he doesn't have the type of success this upcoming season that we want. But I think as far as the ceiling goes, again, we're talking about something north of $15 million, pushing that $18 million that we projected earlier in the episode. So, if we just split the difference, I think a healthy projection for Zach Harrison on a second contract would be somewhere in that $10 to $12 million range. And I think based off of where we expect Zach Harrison to be, I think he's well worth that type of price tag. I don't think we'll be complaining about, we're overpaying Zach Harrison. Well, maybe some people will. People always get tight about Arthur Blank's money when it comes time to pay guys, and then they treat it like it's their money. It's like, it ain't your money, right? Stop pocket watching, right? But I think Zach Harrison is worth $10 million a year if he continues to play at the level that he's played at so far in these last 3 years, at least in terms of the flashes that we've seen. And, Harrison's a player that I've grown fond of over the years, right? I know going into that pre-draft cycle, I was just kind of like, I don't get the hype on Zach Harrison, right? But then after the draft, after the Falcons selected him and doing the deep dive on his film, I came to appreciate him more. That's often the case where I'm just like, you watch 2 or 3 games of a guy and you're like, all right, I don't get the hype. And then you watch like 12 games of a guy and you're like, okay, I get it a little bit more. And, I think a lot of that, as we stated back then, was because Ohio State was trying to make him into this finesse pass rusher a la Nick Bosa and Chase Young, his predecessors there, rather than leaning into his bully skill set. And that's what he is, just a power player, just be a bully. And he's done that in the pros, and I think that's made him to a much more effective role player. And we'll see if he can ascend to be beyond being a role player. He's a plus run defender in addition to the pass rush upside. The length and strength that he has makes him a force against the run, as well as a pass rusher that can collapse the pocket. And so my hopes are that this season we'll see Zach Harrison, similar to Matthew Bergeron, kind of put it all together and have that sort of breakout year. And so even if Zach Harrison isn't getting huge sack totals, you're still going to see him be a key cog in this pass rush, right? When you have two speed rushers like James Pearce and Jalon Walker screaming off the edges, you want to have those pocket pushers, those collapsers up the middle. And I think Zach Harrison fits into that paradigm where, when you have the speed rushers coming off the edge, that forces the quarterback to step up in the pocket, and you can get a lot of those cleanup production for guys like Brandon Dorlus and Zach Harrison, who did an excellent job of that, which is why their sack totals, I'm not going to say are inflated, but are probably higher than what you would think based off of their win rates last season. And then if you have the interior collapsing the pocket, that pins the quarterback deep in the pocket, and that allows your speed rushers off the edge to go out there and get home as well. So it works all hand in hand, and I think there's a lot of room for potential with this pass rush if Harrison can make that leap, especially if Walker and Pearce and Dorlus as well continue to show progress this upcoming season. And we may have legitimately a 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and several of those guys being in the primes of their careers. It has been unprecedented in the history of Atlanta Falcons. So, we're leaving off today's episode with positivity. It's like, oh, what are we doing? I got a cold shiver down my spine. But that's what we're hoping to see from this team this season. I think Zach Harrison serves a big part of that conversation. And especially if he, those first 6 games with James Pearce expected to be out of the lineup, if he can really, make that leap, that will be huge for the Falcons as they sort of just try to tread water from a pass rush standpoint before James Pearce returns. And of course, lights the world on fire, because, if this man could get 10.5 sacks last year as a part-time player, just imagine what he could do. We already broke that down previously on the podcast. So go check out that episode if you missed it. But, if you want to push that hype, then by all means, you do you. We, on the other hand, we'll put our hopes and dreams in the Dorluses and the Harrisons and the Jalon Walkers moving forward in terms of delivering on that pass rush, because I think that really, gives you a solid floor and foundation for your pass rush until you figure out just how reliable James Pearce is going to be into the future because of all the off-field stuff, as well as the volatility of sacks. But that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. Tomorrow we will be analyzing those 6 to 8 second practice clips. Should we get them? We might also talk about Brian Robinson, the new Falcons backup running back to Bijan Robinson, and what is his potential in this offense. So make sure you don't miss that. And if you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Ad-free experience, members-only Discord, sweet Locked On merch, and it's all available at the link in the description below, and a 7-day free trial to try it out, see if you like it. And then you can keep signing up at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. Guys, it is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.